They said Cedar Hollow was a quiet mountain town buried under snow and silence. But one winter evening, a battle-scarred veteran and a colossal black horse stumbled upon a ranger's jeep, lying wrecked at the bottom of an icy ravine. Inside was a woman fighting for her life, and a secret powerful enough to shatter the town's fragile peace. What happened next would drag the entire community into a storm of betrayal, courage, and revelations no one saw coming. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. Winter had a way of swallowing Cedar Hollow whole. From a distance, the little Montana town looked as if it had been carved into the edge of the mountains, wedged between slopes of black pine that reached upward like watchful sentinels. By December, snow smothered the rooftops, drifted waist-high along the fences, and wrapped the roads in a treacherous glaze of ice. The ridgeline stood sharp and unforgiving against a pale sky, and the forests carried a hush that made even the crows seem reluctant to speak. When the wind funneled down through the passes, it howled across the valley like a ghost refusing to rest. The town itself was small enough that one could walk from one end to the other in 20 minutes. Fewer than 1,000 people called Cedar Hollow home, most of them descended from families that had worked the timber mills or guided hunting trips for generations. Their lives bent with the seasons logging when the weather allowed outfitting tourists in the warmer months, and enduring the long freeze of winter with wood stoves and patience. That winter had been particularly brutal. Shops on Main Street closed early, their neon signs blinking out one by one, as if the cold itself demanded silence. A curl of chimney smoke rose from each clapboard house, dissolving quickly into the gray sky. Footsteps crunched loud on frozen sidewalks, and every sound seemed amplified in the hush, the slam of a truck door, the bark of a chained dog, the distant crack of ice splitting on the river. From the outside, it might have looked picturesque, like something worth photographing for a postcard. But anyone who lived there knew better. There was an unease beneath the stillness, a tension that lingered behind shuttered windows and in the long pauses of conversation at the diner. Cedar Hollow looked asleep, but sleep did not always mean peace. At the far edge of town, where the street lamps no longer reached and the pine forest crowded close, stood a small, weathered cabin. The roof sagged under decades of snow. The porch steps leaned, and the walls bore the gray stain of years' worth of storms. Few people ever walked that far, and those who did usually kept their eyes down and their mouths shut. They all knew who lived there, and though most would have denied it aloud, they carried the same thought in their heads at the Marine. Ethan Cole had been 38 that winter. He was a tall man, his frame still strong from years of military conditioning, though thinner now, worn down by long nights and a hunger he didn't always notice until it gnawed at him. His hair, once kept short to regulation, had grown longer, peppered with strands of gray that seemed too early for his age. His face carried sharp planes hollowed by insomnia, and his beard often looked more like neglect than style. But it was his eyes that unsettled people most deep-set, restless, as if they were always half-turned toward a battlefield no one else could see. He had spent most of his adult life in the Marine Corps, cycling through tours in Afghanistan that blurred together into sand heat and blood. He came back with scars he could show, and more he could not. The doctors had labeled it post-traumatic stress disorder, but Ethan called it something simpler: ghosts. They woke him in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat. They sat with him at breakfast, invisible but heavy, whispering memories of places and names he'd buried. Back in Cedar Hollow, he tried to make himself useful without being noticed. He picked up odd jobs, splitting firewood for old neighbors, fixing roofs when shingles gave way, under snow, guiding hunters who couldn't find their way through the timberland without getting lost. He hunted deer and elk in the fall, stacked the meat in a freezer that hummed in the corner of his cabin, and lived lean the rest of the year. People paid him cash, nodded politely, and then moved on, glad to have his strength but uncomfortable with his silence. When Ethan walked into town, the conversations at Edna's diner sometimes faltered. He didn't miss it. He didn't need their approval. But every so often, when the loneliness stretched too wide inside him, he wondered if he would ever truly belong again. Peace was something he craved, yet every night, when he closed his eyes, the desert followed him into the cold. If there was one creature who did not shy away from him, it was Shadow. The horse had come into Ethan's life 2 winters earlier, the way storms sometimes arrive without warning, loud, impossible to ignore, and leaving a mark that lingers. Shadow was enormous, larger than any horse Ethan had ridden during training exercises on base. His coat was black without interruption, a darkness so complete it seemed to drink the light around him. His mane tangled long and wild, and across his left shoulder stretched a scar jagged and pale against the dark hair, a reminder of a chain or a battle Ethan could only guess at. Locals said the horse had been wild once, roaming the upper valleys with a small band of Mustangs. He'd earned a reputation as unbreakable, too violent for ranchers to tame. A few had tried and failed, some left with broken bones for their arrogance. Eventually, Shadow had been abandoned. Too much trouble, too much danger. But not for Ethan. The first time he had seen Shadow was in the clearing behind his cabin. The horse had been standing there in the snow, steam rising from his nostrils, watching Ethan with eyes that held no fear, only recognition. Ethan had stood his ground, waiting. In the silence between them, something unspoken passed, an understanding that neither belonged anywhere else. From that night on, Shadow stayed. The horse was not tame in the ordinary sense. He tolerated no one else near him, snapping and stamping if townsfolk tried. But with Ethan, he was calm, almost gentle. At night, when Ethan woke from a nightmare, he sometimes stepped outside to find Shadow waiting in the moonlight, ears pricked as if he too had been roused by echoes of the past. The horse would paw the frozen earth steady and rhythmic until Ethan's breathing matched it. Shadow carried his own kind of silence, and Ethan recognized it. They were 2 castaways who had found one another on the far edge of a town that would never truly claim them. In Cedar Hollow, people whispered. Ethan was the Marine who didn't fit anymore, to the man who sat alone at the back of the diner and stared out the window as if expecting incoming fire. Shadow was the horse too wild to break, too dangerous to ride, except Ethan somehow did. Together, they looked like exiles, a reminder of things the town didn't want to face. But at the cost of wars fought far away, the untamed force of nature no fence could contain. Children stared wide-eyed when they saw Ethan ride into town on the black horse, towering and spectral against the white snow. Parents pulled them close, whispering caution. Some said Ethan had lost his mind, that he spoke more to the horse than to people. Others claimed Shadow was cursed, that no normal animal would choose to follow a man like that. Ethan never corrected them. He didn't care for their approval. What mattered was the bond he felt each time he set his hand against Shadow's scarred shoulder, and the horse stilled as though the touch anchored them both. They were in every sense outsiders, but they were outsiders together. The sky was burning red when Ethan took Shadow up the narrow trail that wound above Cedar Hollow. Twilight always settled fast in the mountains, slipping down the ridges like a hand pulling shadows over the land. The sun hovered low, staining the snow with streaks of fire, while the forests on either side stretched their long, dark fingers across the white slopes. For most people, dusk in winter meant retreat back to fires, back to warm kitchens, back to the company of family. For Ethan, it meant escape. He preferred the world in that in-between light, when color drained and silence deepened. Shadow's hooves struck a steady rhythm against the frozen earth, the sound muted by snow. The horse's breath came in thick clouds, curling upward like smoke from a forge. The creak of the saddle leather, the rattle of the bit, the crunch of iron shoes biting through crusted snow, those were the evening's only songs. Ethan leaned into the sway's shoulders, loosening after a long day, the cold air sharpening his senses. He rode without destination. He told himself he sought nothing more than quiet. Yet his mind betrayed him. Memories slid in uninvited, the roar of engines, the pop of small arms fire, the cries that never left him. Winter dusk blurred into desert twilight. Snow became dust. The smell of pine dissolved into cordite and sweat. His pulse quickened until he forced himself to breathe, with Shadow's stride, in and out steady, until the ghosts retreated far enough for him to focus on the present. Then Shadow stopped. It was sudden jarring. One heartbeat, the horse was moving; the next, he froze mid-stride, head-high ears, rigid nostrils flaring wide. Muscles bunched along his powerful frame, as though every fiber of him was drawn taut. Ethan almost lurched forward in the saddle. He knew better than to force the animal onward. "What is it, boy?" His voice came out low, careful. The answer was a sound that rattled the mountainside. Shadow's shrill, defiant whinny, echoing off rock and pine, until it seemed 100 horses cried out in unison. The sound raised the hair along Ethan's neck. Shadow did not spook easily. For him to call like that, to announce himself to the whole valley, meant something was wrong. Ethan's instincts, the ones carved into him by years of war, kicked awake. He tightened his grip on the reins, feeling the leather bite into his gloves. His eyes swept the slope, scanning tree lines, gullies, anything that might conceal movement. Silence pressed in after the echo faded. Only the wind hissed. Shadow shifted, pawed the snow, then swung his great head toward the switchback further along the ridge. He tugged once sharply, as if demanding Ethan follow. "All right," Ethan muttered. He gave the reins slack. "Lead on." The horse moved with urgency, every stride confident. Ethan's heart knocked harder against his ribs. He had learned long ago to trust animals. They felt what humans missed: the shift of air, the faint tang of something unnatural. If Shadow said there was danger, Ethan believed him. The trail bent sharply, a curve where rock outcroppings hid the road below. As they came around, Ethan smelled it before he saw acrid metallic, the sting of gasoline on cold air. Then his eyes locked on the scene sprawled at the bottom of the embankment. A Jeep lay on its side against the snowbank roof, caved windshields spiderwebbed into glittering shards. One tire still spun feebly, squealing against the ice, as if unwilling to admit defeat. Steam hissed from the crumpled hood, rising in frantic plumes that twisted into the cold dusk. A long black scar marred the road where rubber had burned, ending in jagged tracks that plummeted over the edge. The world went very still. Even the wind seemed to pause, as though unwilling to disturb the wreck. Ethan's breath caught. He dismounted fast, boots crunching deep. Shadow tossed his head, nostrils flaring harder, his entire body bristling with a restless energy. Ethan glanced once at the horse. "Stay," he ordered, though he knew Shadow would do what he pleased. Ethan slid, half climbed, half fell down the slope. His boots slipped on the ice, sending cascades of powder tumbling around him. But he caught himself against the battered frame of the Jeep. The metal was cold beneath his gloves, slick with snow. He leaned down and peered through the shattered window. There was someone inside. A woman. She was slumped forward over the wheel, her long dark hair tangled and matted with blood. Her uniform forest green jacket with the state ranger insignia was torn, flecked with glass. Crimson stained her collar, already stiff where it had frozen. For an instant, Ethan thought she was gone, another lifeless body on a battlefield that would haunt him. Then he saw it barely, but there, the rise and fall of her chest, shallow, uneven, but present. "Jesus," Ethan whispered. He yanked at the door. It groaned, but refused. He put his shoulder to it, muscles straining, gritting his teeth until the hinges gave with a scream. Snow cascaded inside, covering the dashboard. Ethan reached in careful of the glass and slid an arm beneath her shoulders. She was lighter than he expected, but limp as a rag. He lifted her free boots, slipping again on the slope until he braced and carried her down onto the snow. The cold bit instantly. He knelt, easing her flat, brushing ice from her hair. Training resurfaced automatic, check the airway, find the pulse. His gloved fingers pressed against her neck until he felt it weak, thready, but there. He lowered his ear to her lips and caught the faintest ghost of breath. "You're alive," he said, more to steady himself than her. Blood ran from a cut along her temple, mingling with snow. He ripped a strip of fabric from the lining of his coat, folded it, pressed it hard against the wound. The woman stirred faintly, a groan escaping her throat. Ethan held pressure, working fast, every movement crisp, efficient like a drill he'd repeated countless times in deserts half a world away. This time, though, his hands trembled more than he cared to admit. "Stay with me," he muttered. "Don't you quit." He bound the makeshift bandage tight, then shifted to check her ribs, her limbs. No compound fractures visible, but bruising along her side suggested broken bones. Moving her could make things worse. Leaving her in the snow was worse still. His chest tightened with the weight of choice. Then her eyes cracked open. Just barely. Brown irises clouded with pain, pupils slow to focus. Her lips parted, breath fogging weakly. She tried to speak. Ethan leaned close. "Don't move. Save your strength." Her voice came out in a whisper so thin he almost missed it. "They tried to silence me." Ethan froze. The words pierced him sharp as ice. Not an accident. Not a skid on black ice. Someone had meant this. Who, he demanded, but her eyes rolled back, lids fluttering shut. Her body went slack, breath dwindling again into shallow pulls. Ethan sat back on his heels, snow soaking into his jeans, heart hammering. The woman's words echoed inside him like gunfire in a canyon. They tried to silence me. Whoever she was, whatever she carried, someone wanted it buried bad enough to leave her dead in a ravine. The snow swallowed sound as Ethan hauled himself back into the saddle. Shadows shifted beneath him, restless hooves stamping at the ice. Ethan settled the unconscious ranger against his chest, her head lolling to one side, hair damp with blood that had already begun to freeze at the tips. She was frighteningly light in his arms, her breath shallow and uneven against his ribs. "Easy," he murmured, though it was as much to himself as to the horse. He pressed his knees into Shadow's flanks. The stallion surged forward, climbing the slope with the sure-footed strength of an animal born for this land. The trail back wound through black trees that creaked beneath their weight of snow. The wind rose sharp and unrelenting, slicing through Ethan's coat, as if the fabric were nothing more than paper. Flakes swirled thick and fast, a curtain that blurred the world down to the few yards of path ahead. Each gust stung his face like needles. His arms tightened instinctively around the woman, shielding her body with his own. Shadow's breath billowed white in the darkness, each exhale a cloud that dissolved as quickly as it appeared. The horse moved carefully, head low, finding purchase on the frozen trail where a lesser mount might have faltered. Ethan kept him steady, holding him just short of a gallop. Every jolt risked reopening wounds, but every moment lost meant the ranger's life slipped further from his grasp. Ethan could hear her faint but undeniable, the shallow wheeze of air through constricted lungs, the occasional hitch that made his heart clench. He tried to push away memory, but Afghanistan was suddenly with him again, carrying wounded men across desert ground, feeling their life ebb out beneath his hands, knowing some would not survive the ride to safety. The cabin, the snow, the pine-scented air, none of it mattered. Only the weight in his arms and the fragile thread of breath that tethered her to this world. Get her there. Just get her there. The descent into Cedar Hollow came like surfacing from water. The storm broke enough for him to glimpse the glow of the town below. Pinpricks of yellow light flickered in the valley, winking through the snow like a constellation fallen to earth. Houses lined the single main street, their windows blurred with frost, their chimneys exhaling ribbons of smoke. Shadows' hooves clattered onto the first stretch of cobbled road, the sound ringing louder than church bells in the muffled night. A few curtains twitched, shadows stirred, but no one emerged. Ethan guided the stallion through the dark street until the squat outline of Cedar Hollow Clinic appeared. The building was old brick, its roof sagging under decades of snow. Frost glazed its windows, obscuring the faint glow inside. A wooden sign half hidden under icicles creaked in the wind. Ethan slid out of the saddle in one motion, cradling the woman close. Shadow threw back his head and let out a piercing whinny that cut through the town like an alarm. The clinic door banged open. Two nurses bundled in heavy coats ran into the storm. Their eyes went wide when they saw the limp body in Ethan's arms. "Ranger down," Ethan barked, his voice carrying the clipped cadence of command. "Head trauma. She needs immediate care." The older nurse, gray hair escaping her hood, nodded briskly. Inside. Quickly, Ethan pushed past the threshold. Warmth hit him like a wave, carrying the sharp scent of antiseptic and boiled coffee. The hall echoed with hurried footsteps, the squeal of rubber soles on linoleum. They cleared a table-wheeled equipment, pulled gloves on with practiced efficiency. He laid the Ranger down, stepping back as hands descended over her. The blood on his coat smeared across the clean sheet, a stark reminder of how close she still hovered to death. Nurse Linda Marsh took charge. She was in her late 50s, small but solid, with cropped silver hair and a face that carried the lines of long winters and longer nights. She snapped orders with a voice that cut through chaos like steel. Oxygen mask, IV line, check her pupils, pressure bandage now. The younger nurses scrambled, fetching supplies, adjusting monitors. Linda leaned close, fingers pressing the wound at the woman's temple, then shifting to check her eyes. "She's still breathing," she announced, calm but firm. "Weak pulse, but it's there. We can stabilize." Ethan stood at the edge of the room, his fists tight, his chest rising and falling in harsh rhythm. His hands were trembling. He stared down at them, at the smear of blood across his knuckles, and memory struck again, another life, on another night, slipping away beneath his grip. He forced himself to breathe, to anchor his mind. In this moment, in this fight. Minutes stretched. Machines beeped, gauze-soaked, crimson fresh bandages replaced the makeshift strips he had tied in the snow. Finally, Linda straightened, tugged her gloves off, and met Ethan's eyes. "She's stable for now. Lucky you got her here when you did." Ethan nodded once. The knot in his chest loosened, if only slightly. The door opened again, a gust of cold sweeping in with Sheriff Hank McAllister. He was a large man in his early 60s, his shoulders broad beneath a long wool coat dusted white. His face was rugged cut with deep lines that made him look perpetually grim. He surveyed the room with sharp, pale eyes that landed on Ethan, then on the Ranger lying bandaged on the bed. "What happened?" His voice carried the gravel of authority. Linda spoke first, rattling off the basics. Jeep overturned head injury, suspected concussion. McAllister listened, his expression unreadable. Ethan stepped forward. She was run off the road. McAllister's eyes flicked to him, narrowing. That's so I saw the tracks. That wasn't ice or bad luck. Someone pushed her. The sheriff's jaw tightened. He gave a small shake of his head, as though brushing away a troublesome fly. Good work bringing her in, he said flatly. His tone carried the weight of dismissal rather than gratitude. Ethan felt heat rise in his chest. You're not listening. That wasn't an accident. McAllister cut him off with a raised hand. The look he gave Ethan was not anger, not disbelief, but something harder to read. After a long pause, he stepped closer, lowered his voice so only Ethan could hear. Careful who you accuse, son. He murmured the words, heavy, deliberate. Truth can bury you faster than a bullet. Ethan met his gaze, searching for meaning. There was no denial in the sheriff's tone, no real attempt to argue. Only a warning, quiet but cold, as if the lawman himself stood in the shadow of something larger. McAllister turned away before Ethan could answer, barking an order to a deputy who had followed him inside. Ethan remained rooted where he stood. The murmur of medical voices blurred into background noise. His thoughts spun sharp and fast. The sheriff's words weren't meant to soothe nor to reassure. They carried weight, the kind that came only when a man knew more than he would admit. The ranger's Sofia Alvarez, he would later learn, lay behind the curtain alive but fragile. Her broken whisper in the snow echoed again in his head. They tried to silence me. Now the sheriff's warning added a second voice. Careful who you accuse. Ethan's jaw clenched. He knew what it meant when authority told a soldier to keep quiet. He had lived that lie before, seen what silence cost. His hands curled into fists. He looked toward the closed door of the room where Sophia was fighting her way back. He didn't know her story yet, or why someone wanted her gone. But he knew this. He had been pulled into it, and the moment shadow carried him down that mountain trail. And there would be no walking away. The storm had eased by morning, leaving behind a sky the color of steel. Clouds hung low and heavy bleeding flurries that drifted in slow spirals, covering the scars of the night before. The mountains crouched beneath the weight of it. Black pines frosted white, their branches sagging like weary arms. Ethan stood outside the cabin, pulling his coat tighter as Shadow stamped impatiently beside him. The stallion's breath came in thick plumes, his ears flicking toward the ridge where the trail climbed. Ethan had been awake since before dawn, staring at the ceiling beams, replaying the sheriff's words again and again. Careful who you accuse, son. Truth can bury you faster than a bullet. He could have left it there. He could have let the ranger's recovery be someone else's problem. But his gut refused to quiet. He had seen too much in war to mistake sabotage for chance. Whatever had happened on that mountain road, it wasn't an accident. Let's go, he muttered. Shadow surged forward, as if he'd been waiting for the command all along. The horse carried Ethan back toward the switchback's hooves, crunching through the crust of new snow. Each breath of cold air bit at Ethan's lungs, sharpening his focus. He told himself he only wanted to confirm what he already suspected. But deep down, he knew he was stepping into something larger. The road lay silent when they reached it. No traffic had passed since the wreck, and the world looked scrubbed clean, save for the scars left behind. The Jeep was gone, hauled away in the night, but the slope still bore the evidence, churned, snow-scattered glass, glinting like diamonds, dark streaks of mud where the tires had bitten before sliding over the edge. The silence pressed against him thick and uncanny, as though the mountain itself remembered what had happened. Shadow slowed to a halt. His ears swiveled, his body tense. Then, with a sudden stomp of his hoof, He struck the snow hard. Ethan frowned, sliding out of the saddle. What is it? The horse pawed again, nostrils flaring, then lowered his head toward the bend in the road. Ethan followed his gaze. At first he saw nothing but white. Then he spotted it, a stain against the purity, a black smear that spread wide across the surface. He crouched, brushing away snow with his gloved hand. Beneath lay a slick, oily patch, dark as ink already seeping into the ice. He touched his fingers to it, rubbed them together, and lifted them to his nose. The scent was unmistakable, harsh, chemical acrid. Brake fluid? A slow chill crept through him that had nothing to do with the cold. A leak could happen, yes, but not like this. Not in a pool wide enough to stain the road. Not at the exact curve where the Jeep had gone over. His instincts, sharpened by years of reading terrain for signs of ambush, told him the truth. The lines had been bled, intentionally. Ethan stood scanning the ridge as though the saboteur might still be lurking. Shadow tossed his head restless, the whites of his eyes flashing. The horse knew too. A low rumble interrupted the silence, the growl of an engine laboring up the grade. Ethan stiffened, hand drifting toward the knife sheathed at his belt. Moments later, a semi-truck appeared around the bend chains, clattering on its tires, exhaust billowing in the cold. The rig slowed when the driver caught sight of Ethan and the black horse standing in the middle of the road. Brakes hissed and the truck ground to a halt. The door creaked open. A man climbed down, heavy boots crunching. He was broad across the shoulders with a thick beard peppered gray and a face weathered by years behind the wheel. His flannel jacket was dusted with snow. "You all right there, friend?" he called. Ethan gestured toward the stain. "Ever seen anything like this?" The trucker trudged closer, squatting beside the patch. He swiped his finger through the residue, sniffed, then let out a low whistle. His brows drew together beneath the brim of his cap. "That's no accident," he said flatly. "Someone bled those brakes dry. Seen it a couple times out on the highways. Mean bastard's trick. You don't walk away from it." Ethan's jaw tightened. The ranger who crashed last night, her Jeep went over right here. The man shook his head grimly. "Then she's damn lucky to be alive." He stood brushing his hands off. "Name's Jack Hanley. Been hauling these roads 20 years. Trust me, this ain't no random failure." Ethan gave a short nod. The confirmation was no comfort, only a weight settling heavier across his chest. Whoever had tried to kill Sofia Alvarez had known exactly what they were doing. Jack studied him a moment longer, then jerked his chin toward the horse. "That's a hell of an animal you've got. Take care of him." With that, the trucker climbed back into his rig. The engine roared, gears grinding as the semi lumbered up the hill and vanished into the curtain of falling snow. Silence reclaimed the road. Ethan turned back toward the curve. Something nagged at him, a pull in his gut. He let Shadow guide him again, watching as the stallion lowered his nose, sniffing at drifts, pawing at the ground. A few yards from the stain, Shadow snorted and shoved his muzzle into a pile of snow. Ethan hurried over, brushing aside the powder. Metal gleamed beneath a corner of something rectangular. He dug it free, heart thudding, until a steel toolbox emerged, half buried, its paint chipped and rust creeping along the edges. He flipped the latches and lifted the lid. Inside lay an assortment of wrenches, sockets, and clamps. But one piece stopped him cold, a brake-bleeding kit, its hose still slick with dark residue. The smell hit him immediately, sharp chemical, undeniable. Whoever had tampered with the Jeep had done it here on this very spot, and left in such haste they'd abandoned their tools. Ethan exhaled slowly, the sound steaming in the frigid air. He slipped gloves tighter, careful not to smudge the evidence. He snapped the box shut and tucked it under his arm. Then he drew his phone, snapping photos of the stain and the scattered footprints pressed faintly into the crust of snow. The prints were blurred, partly filled by fresh flakes, but they were their proof that someone had stood here, bent over the Jeep, and prepared its destruction. Shadows shifted beside him, stamping again as though impatient. Ethan looked up at the ridgeline. The forest loomed, dark branches weaving like bars. He felt exposed, a target on an empty road. Whoever had done this might return to cover their tracks. "Easy boy," he said, though his own voice was tight. "We're leaving." He slid the toolbox into a burlap sack he carried and tied it shut. The weight of it pressed against his palm as he mounted. It felt heavier than steel, heavier than evidence. It felt like a burden he couldn't set down. Shadow climbed the slope without hesitation. Ethan kept his gaze moving, scanning the tree line. Every shadow seemed deeper, every silence louder. His breath fogged inside the scarf, pulled high across his face. At the top of the ridge, he reined in the stallion and turned back for one last look. The curve lay quiet again, snow already drifting over the footprints, erasing them grain by grain. But the truth was no longer buried. It was in his hands. Ethan drew a long breath, letting the cold fill his lungs. He looked down into the ravine where Sophia had nearly died. He imagined the Jeep tumbling the moment of silence before impact, the stillness after. His gut clenched. This wasn't chance. This wasn't fate. It was intent. And intent meant danger. His mind flashed to the faces of men he'd known in war choices they'd had to make, when confronted with truths that could kill them. He recognized that same crossroad now. He could walk away, pretend it wasn't his fight. Or he could step forward knowing it would drag him into shadows he couldn't yet see. Ethan tightened his grip on the sack. The metal edges bit against his fingers, grounding him. The evidence belonged not to him, but to the ranger who had whispered her warning through cracked lips. They tried to silence me. He would hold it for her. He would put it in her hands when she woke. Because the truth, no matter how dangerous, belonged to her and to whatever justice Cedar Hollow still had left. He turned Shadow toward home, the stallion's stride strong against the drifts. The wind rose again, whistling through the pines, carrying the promise that this was only the beginning. The clinic smelled of antiseptic and steam heat. Morning fog clung to the windows, dulling the weak sunlight that filtered through. In the small room, a radiator clanked intermittently, fighting the chill that pressed against the old brick walls. Sophia Alvarez stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, lashes dark against pale skin. A low groan slipped from her lips as she shifted against the pillows. The bandage wrapped around her head tugged when she moved, a dull ache radiating through her skull. For a moment, she didn't know where she was, only that the air smelled sharp and sterile instead of pine and snow. Then her gaze cleared enough to find the figure sitting near her bed. Ethan sat on a wooden chair, elbows on his knees, hands clasped loosely. His coat was draped across the back of the chair, boots scuffed and dusted with old snow. His face was gaunt from lack of sleep, beard shadowing his jaw, but his eyes were steady, fixed on her, as if he'd been watching for hours. Outside the window, just visible through the fogged glass, Shadow stood tethered to the post. The black stallion stood motionless, head-high mane stirring faintly with each breath. He looked less like a horse than a sentinel posted guard outside the ranger's room. Sophia licked her lips, voice raw when she finally spoke. "What happened?" Ethan leaned forward. "Your Jeep went over the ridge. You hit bad. I found you. Got you here in time." Her eyes flickered, widening slightly. "You." She tried to sit up, winced at the pull in her ribs. "You found me." Ethan nodded once. Something unreadable crossed her face. Relief, yes, but also a spark of suspicion. He was the Marine, the recluse on the edge of town. The man people whispered about at the diner but didn't invite into conversation. Of all people to find her in the snow, why him? She closed her eyes briefly, exhaling a shaky breath. "Then I owe you my life." Ethan didn't answer. He wasn't looking for gratitude. He only wanted to know why someone had tried to erase her from the mountain road. It took her some time to gather her strength. Linda had been through earlier, checked her vitals, admonished her not to talk too long. But when the door closed and silence settled, Sophia turned her face toward Ethan. "You need to know," she whispered, voice still weak, but sharpened by resolve. "This wasn't an accident." "I know," Ethan said. His tone was quiet but certain. He reached into his coat and set the burlap sack on the chair beside him. I went back, found what they left behind. Sophia's brows furrowed. He didn't open the sack, not yet, but the weight of it seemed to anchor the air between them. She drew a breath, wincing at the pain in her side. "I've been investigating Morton Timber Company." Ethan's gaze sharpened. He'd heard the name, of course, everyone in Cedar Hollow had. Morton. He said it like testing the word on his tongue. Sophia nodded. "To this town, he's the benefactor. Donations for the church, scholarships for kids, half the school's roof paid out of his pocket. He's on every board, every committee. People call him a saint." Her lips curled in a bitter line. "But saints don't strip forests bare in the dead of night." Her voice grew steadier as she went on, fueled by months of pent-up evidence. "Export records don't match what's being cut. I've tracked trucks, unmarked semis moving through restricted zones after midnight. And in the preserve, the old growth stands protected by law. I've found stumps, ancient trees felled and dragged out like carcasses." She swallowed hard. "I've been documenting everything. Photographs, shipment logs, notes on which routes they use. Morton isn't a philanthropist. He's bleeding the forest dry, turning it into money, hiding behind his reputation." Her words hung heavy in the small room. Ethan sat back slowly, jaw tightening. He'd seen warlords and contractors put on the same masks overseas, smiling for the cameras, while burying secrets in sand. "Morton Timber," he muttered. "Never thought to hear his name tied to this." "Because he's bought the silence," Sophia replied. "No one dares question him. The town lives off his payroll, his handouts. To go against him is to cut yourself off from Cedar Hollow's lifeline. So he keeps smiling, keeps giving, and no one sees what he's taking." Her hand clenched faintly over the blanket. "Until I did." Her eyes closed briefly, as if the memory still scraped raw. When she opened them again, they glinted with something colder. "I'd known for weeks I was being watched," she admitted. "Parked cars on the road near my cabin. Footsteps outside my window when the forest should have been dead quiet. At first I thought I was imagining it. Too many nights alone make you hear things. But it kept happening." Ethan didn't interrupt. "The night of the crash," Sophia continued. "I'd left the ranger station late. I had a folder of notes with me, evidence. On the road, I saw headlights in my mirror. A truck. It stayed back just far enough to make me uneasy. Then on the switchback..." She paused, her breath catching. "There was a hit, a jolt from behind. I lost control. The Jeep slid. After that, nothing but snow and pain." Her fingers trembled on the blanket. "Someone wanted me dead. It wasn't about scaring me off. It was about silencing me completely. If you hadn't found me..." She didn't finish. She didn't have to. The words she had gasped in the snow came back to him now, clear, undeniable. They tried to silence me. Ethan sat still for a long moment. The radiator clanked, a bird called faintly outside. But inside the room, the weight of her confession pressed down like the storm clouds overhead. He wasn't surprised. Not truly. He had known since the moment he saw the brake fluid stain on the road that this was deliberate. But hearing her speak it aloud brought the danger into shape. He thought of Sheriff McAllister, his warning whispered like a secret. Truth can bury you faster than a bullet. That wasn't denial. That was fear. Ethan's eyes lowered to his hands, scarred and calloused hands that had carried too many men to their deaths. He'd told himself he'd come home to escape it, to bury the wars in solitude. But here it was again, the powerful preying on the vulnerable, the truth trampled under greed. He looked at Sophia. She was pale, shaking, but her eyes burned with a fire he recognized. He had seen it in soldiers who refused to back down, even when the odds screamed at them to run. If they wanted you gone, Ethan said quietly, they'll come back. And next time, they won't miss. Her breath caught, but she didn't argue. He leaned forward, his voice hardening. You're not facing this alone. For a long moment, Sophia studied him. Perhaps she searched for hesitation, some sign that he would abandon her once the danger grew real. But all she found was steadiness, carved in the hard lines of his face. He had carried her out of the wreck, bled his hands on broken glass, braved the storm with her life against his chest. Now he was offering more. His silence, broken, his isolation, shattered to stand with her against a man the whole town revered. It was madness. It was also the only hope she had. Ethan exhaled, the sound rough. I'll help you keep the evidence safe. We'll find more. Enough that even Morton's money can't bury it. His gaze flicked toward the sack on the chair. And when the time's right, we'll bring it out. Sophia's throat worked as she swallowed. Gratitude flickered across her face, tempered by fear. She knew the cost of pulling him into this. He was no longer just the recluse veteran at the edge of town. Now he was a target, same as her. Outside the window, shadows stirred, releasing a soft wicker that fogged the glass. His ears flicked forward as if answering the unspoken pact. The sound broke the tension. Ethan glanced at the horse, then back at Sophia. His expression softened, if only slightly. Guess that makes 3 of us. She allowed herself a faint, exhausted smile. But when her eyes drifted to the ceiling, her face turned solemn again. Because even with Ethan's promise, even with Shadow's strength, she knew the truth. Stepping into the light meant painting targets on their backs. Morton would not forgive, and he would not fail a second time. Rumors travel faster than snowmelt in Cedar Hollow. By the morning after Sophia Alvarez opened her eyes in the clinic, the story had already rooted itself in every corner of town. At the gas station, men in work coats leaned against their pickups, murmuring about sabotage. At the grocery store, women filled baskets with flour and beans while whispering questions into the aisles. Had the brakes really been cut? Was Morton involved? Even in the pews of the small clapboard church, whispers swirled under the hymns. Half the town believed Ethan Cole had saved the ranger's life, and that someone powerful had tried to end it. The other half dismissed it as exaggeration from a man they'd long considered unstable. He's a Marine, one said. Of course he sees enemies behind every tree. Or maybe another countered, he just happened to be there when she needed him. Lines were drawn invisible, but palpable. Every glance on Main Street seemed to carry suspicion. Every conversation lingered with a question unasked. The winter silence that once blanketed Cedar Hollow was broken, replaced by a restless tension. The town wasn't sleeping anymore. It was watching. Edna's Diner was where the watching became talking. The small corner eatery with its red leather booths and walls lined with faded photographs of hunting parties had always been the town's unofficial newsroom. Whatever wasn't printed in the weekly Gazette was chewed over here with coffee and eggs. On that brittle morning, the air smelled of bacon grease and maple syrup, but the taste of gossip was stronger. The bell over the door jingled. Every head turned. Ethan stepped inside the cold, still clinging to his coat, followed by Sophia. She walked carefully, bandages visible beneath her ranger cap color, still not fully returned to her cheeks. Shadow was tethered outside his silhouette, looming through the frosted window like a dark sentinel. The diner went quiet for a beat too long. Forks hovered. Coffee cups paused midair. Then conversations resumed quieter than before, eyes sliding back to the pair as they took a booth near the back. Edna Parker herself stood behind the counter, a woman of 65, with hair the color of steel wool and an expression that never quite softened. She poured coffee with one hand, balanced a cigarette in the other, and carried herself like someone who had survived more winters than the town itself. Well, she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, never thought a war vet and a wild horse would be the ones to save this town. A ripple of laughter followed, small, uneasy, half amusement and half mockery. Ethan's jaw worked, but he stayed silent, staring into the steam rising from his coffee. Sophia stiffened her eyes, flashing lips parting with the sting of words unsaid. Edna's smirk lingered, but it faltered when a man in a booth muttered, "She's alive, ain't she? Maybe there's truth in it after all." Another voice, softer, "Sophia's no liar. If she says it wasn't an accident, I believe her." The diner hummed with contradiction, skepticism, doubt, curiosity, and a thin thread of hope. Ethan let it wash over him, stone-faced. He'd been stared at before, judged before. But he caught Sophia's clenched hands on the tabletop, her knuckles pale. She wasn't used to being doubted. She'd spent her career as the steady voice of law in the forest. Now her word was being weighed like rumor. "Eat," Ethan murmured to her. Let them talk. Word spread faster than the snow melted off Shadow's mane. By the week's end, Sophia's recovery was clear proof of resilience. She walked the streets again, slower, but steady, and when asked directly, she didn't hide. "I was followed," she told the shopkeeper at the hardware store. "My brakes were tampered with. I remember headlights," she explained to a neighbor. "A truck behind me before the crash." Her voice carried weight. She had lived in Cedar Hollow for years. Folks knew her as a ranger who enforced permits fairly, who pulled hunters out of storms, who spoke plainly without embellishment. Seeing her with bandages and bruises, hearing her steady tone, many found it hard to dismiss her words as fantasy. The rumors forked. No longer just about Ethan's credibility, but about Morton Timber. Could the man who funded the Christmas lights in town square, who shook hands at every charity drive, truly order a ranger killed? People didn't know what to believe, but they began to wait, watching as if the truth itself might step out of the shadows. Ethan didn't care about whispers. He cared about proof. So when Sophia suggested they return to the scene, he saddled Shadow without hesitation. The sky was leaden that afternoon, clouds bruising toward storm. The wind cut low through the pines, carrying the scent of sap and snow. Shadow moved with deliberate care up the mountain trail, his hooves crunching deep breath, rising like smoke. At the bend where the jeep had gone over, Sophia paused. She looked down at the ravine, her face pale beneath her cap. Ethan dismounted, scanning the ground. Snow had fallen again, softening the sharp lines of evidence. But Shadow pawed the crust, nostrils flaring. He snorted and lowered his head, following something unseen. "There," Ethan said. Together they brushed back the snow. Beneath lay faint depressions, boot prints blurred, but still visible. Ethan crouched, measuring them with his hand. Too large for Sophia, too heavy. He lifted his phone, snapping photographs from every angle. Not yours, he confirmed. Sophia opened her field notebook, the one she always carried in her ranger vest. Kneeling in the snow, she sketched the scene, the angle of the slope, the scatter of glass, the trail of brake fluid still faintly staining the ice. Her pencil moved with precision, every line a reconstruction. Side by side, they worked, one soldier, one ranger. Their roles different, their purpose now the same. As they combed the ground, Ethan's sharp eye caught glinting metal half buried in drift. He bent, brushing aside snow, and found a lone bolt, the kind used in brake assemblies. Nearby, tangled in ice, was a scrap of fabric, rough cotton, stained dark. He pried it free, carefully slipping it into a plastic bag. Sophia watched, lips pressed tight. Someone was careless. Or rushed, Ethan replied, which tells us they'll try again to cover it. He tucked the evidence away, his expression unreadable. But she saw the weight in his eyes. He wasn't just collecting pieces. He was fitting them into a picture only he seemed to recognize. When she glanced down into the ravine again, the drop looked steeper, crueler than she remembered. A shudder passed through her. If you hadn't found me. Ethan didn't look at her, only at the horizon where the pines closed like ranks of soldiers. His reply was short iron in his tone. Then Morton's story would already be written. Her gaze lingered on him, uncertain but steady. Ethan tightened the strap on his pack, slid the phone back into his pocket. Then let's write a different ending. The words hung between them, simple but immovable like granite rising from the mountain. Shadow snorted, stamping once. His black coat gleamed against the snow, his breath streaming in long white clouds. He stood as if carved from stone, yet his eyes glinted with fire. Sophia looked at him, and for a heartbeat, she felt the weight of a symbol, strength, loyalty, a living shadow carrying truth on its back. The mountain wind keened through the trees. Ethan and Sophia stood side by side, evidence gathered, resolve hardening. The path forward was dangerous, but the choice had already been made. The wind howled across the ridge that night, sweeping snow into drifts that climbed the walls of Ethan's cabin. The little structure sat alone at the edge of the forest, a single lantern glow flickering against the storm. Inside, the wood stove popped and hissed, casting restless shadows across the timber walls. Ethan sat hunched at the table, photographs and scribbled notes spread between him and Sophia. The pictures of oil stains, blurred boot prints, and the corroded brake bleeder kit glared back at them like silent accusations. The evidence was damning but thin, like ice over a deep lake. One misstep and it would shatter. Sophia traced her finger over a sketch in her notebook, her face pale but sharp with determination. The bandage around her head caught the firelight, and her eyes burned with a mixture of pain and defiance. "We've got enough to prove intent," she said quietly, "but not enough to bring him down. Not yet." Ethan didn't answer. His jaw worked as he stared at the photographs. He knew she was right. He also knew they had already gone too far to step back. The sheriff's warning still echoed in his skull, "Truth can bury you faster than a bullet." Outside, shadows shifted restlessly in the snow. The stallion stamped once, shook his heavy mane, and blew steam into the cold night. He stood like a dark sentinel, ears flicking toward the forest, as though listening to something Ethan and Sophia couldn't hear. The cabin was quiet but tense, the silence of two people who understood that the path ahead could only lead deeper into danger. The danger arrived just before midnight. The storm's howl masked the first sounds, snow sliding off the roof, the faint click of a latch. Ethan's head snapped up anyway, instincts wired to hear trouble in silence. The hair on his neck prickled. He rose from his chair without a word, his body suddenly taut. The back door creaked open. A draft of icy air slipped inside. Two figures slid through the gap like shadows. Both wore black coats, their faces hidden behind balaclavas. One carried a knife that caught the firelight in a quick glint. The other held a pistol fitted with a silencer, the steel dark and lethal. Sophia inhaled sharply. Her hand darted beneath the table, finding the small pistol Ethan had insisted she keep near. The weapon felt heavy, unfamiliar in her hand, but the sight of intruders erased hesitation. The fire crackled. The intruders moved closer, their shadows looming long across the walls. The air in the cabin turned to glass, brittle with the promise of violence. Ethan moved first. His training never left him. It lived in his muscles, his breath the snap of instinct that belonged to battlefields half a world away. He lunged, shoving Sophia down behind the chair as the silenced pistol spat. The round tore into the log wall, splinters flying. He grabbed the chair and flung it across the room. It slammed into the gunman's chest, staggering him, buying Ethan the second he needed. He closed the distance, slamming into the intruder. The pistol skittered across the floor. The cabin filled with the sounds of a fight, grunts, the crash of bodies against furniture, the crack of wood splintering. Ethan's breath came harsh, his muscles straining as he wrestled for control. The smell of sweat mingled with smoke and iron. Behind him, Sophia crouched, heart hammering, the pistol shaking in her grip. She forced herself to steady her hands, keeping her aim locked on the second man, the one with the knife. His eyes gleamed behind the mask, calculating, waiting for an opening. The opening never came. The front door exploded inward with a thunderous crack. A blur of black muscle and fury filled the doorway. Shadow. The stallion charged into the cabin like a storm given flesh. His eyes burned in the firelight, ears flat, teeth bared. He lowered his massive head and drove his shoulder into the knife-wielding intruder. The man flew across the room, slamming against the wall with a scream. The knife clattered to the floor as he crumpled, clutching his arm. The second intruder, still grappling with Ethan, froze in shock. His eyes flicked to the horse too late. Shadows spun hooves, striking the wooden floor with a sound like gunfire. The sheer force of the stallion's presence filled the room, rattling the very walls. The man faltered, terror flashing in his eyes. Ethan used the hesitation, driving his forearm into the attacker's throat and wrenching him down. The pistol lay within reach. Ethan kicked it away. The cabin had become chaos, firelight. Flickering snow whirling through the open door, the crash of men and beast locked in violence. But it was a chaos Ethan understood. He bent it to his will. With a grunt, Ethan locked his arm around the gunman's neck, dragging him into a chokehold. The man thrashed, gasping until the fight bled out of him. "Drop it!" Sophia shouted, her voice raw but steady. She had found her strength, the pistol leveled on both intruders. The man's shadow had struck, was whimpering, his arm twisted at an unnatural angle, blood seeping through his glove. He lay half-conscious on the floor. The other wheezed against Ethan's grip, eyes wild above the mask. "Try anything," Ethan growled into his ear, "and you won't walk out." For a moment, no one moved but the horse. Shadow stood at the center of the cabin chest, heaving ears pricked forward, his body radiating power. The intruders had brought knives and guns. Ethan had brought war. Shadow had brought something older, something primal. And together, it was enough. The man with the broken arm moaned, rolling weakly. His partner's gaze darted to the window. Desperation surged. With a sudden twist, he tore free from Ethan's grip and lunged for the opening. He dove headfirst through the glass, the window shattering into a spray of shards. Sophia gasped, rushing to the broken frame. Outside, snow swallowed the man as he vanished into the dark, his footsteps fading into the storm. Ethan cursed, yanking rope from the storage chest. He turned to the remaining intruder, the one Shadow had crippled, and bound him tight, wrists and ankles cinched, until he could hardly twitch. The man whimpered as Ethan hauled him upright and shoved him against the wall. His mask was torn off, revealing a sweat-slicked, fear-stricken face. Ethan's voice dropped to a growl. "You're going to talk," the captive did. Pain and panic loosened his tongue faster than threats could. Blood dripped from his broken arm as he stammered through ragged breaths. We didn't pick this fight. We were sent. Morton." Sophia stiffened. "Morton Timber." The man nodded desperately. "He hired us. Said the ranger was digging too deep. Said she had files that could bury him. We were told to finish it to make sure she couldn't talk." Silence slammed down on the cabin. The fire snapped loudly, spitting sparks into the air. Sophia's face drained of color. Ethan's expression hardened into stone. Morton, the philanthropist, the donor, the man whose name was carved on the plaque above the church door, whose checks kept the school lights burning, the town saint. The mask was gone. In its place stood a predator who had ordered death to protect his empire of stolen trees and laundered lies. Sophia lowered her pistol slowly, but her hands shook with fury. The whispers she'd spoken in the snow, the suspicion she had nursed, had now crystallized into truth. Ethan stared at the bound man, his chest rising and falling. He had seen corruption before, but never so close to home. His voice was quiet, dangerous. Then the whole town's been living under his lie. The man swallowed, eyes darting between them, desperate to bargain. "I just did what I was told, please." Ethan stepped closer, his shadow falling heavy. "And what Morton told you," he said, voice cold as the storm outside was to kill a ranger who stood in his way. The man whimpered, but the truth had already landed like a thunderclap. Sophia met Ethan's gaze. For the first time since the crash, there was no doubt, no hesitation. Only resolve. Snow still clung to Ethan's boots when he followed Deputy Claire Whitman into the small operations room at the station. The captive from the cabin had been handed off to officers for processing, but his words still echoed in Ethan's ears. Morton wanted her silenced. Claire leaned over the table, her blonde hair pulled back in a tight braid, glasses catching the harsh light of the overhead lamp. Spread before her was a map of the Morton Timber compound edges, weighed down with coffee mugs. She tapped the paper with a pen voice, clipped and precise. "This is our chance," she said. "We move tonight before he knows one of his men cracked. If we give him daylight, he'll torch everything." Sophia stood across from her, pale from blood loss, but upright determination etched across her features. Ethan hovered nearby, arms folded, the shadows under his eyes, darker than the night outside. Claire's jaw tightened. Morton's been slippery for years. Donations lawyers a halo so polished the whole town swore by it. But if half of what your witness said is true, he's storing evidence in that warehouse. We take it, we bury him. "Then let's bury him," Ethan said. His voice was calm but final. Claire hesitated, studying him. "You're not law enforcement. This could get ugly." Ethan leaned forward, pressing a scarred hand onto the map. "I've started this fight. I'll see it through." For a long moment, Claire held his gaze. Then she gave a sharp nod. "Fine. But you stay with my unit." Cowboy moves. The storm rattled the windows, but in the cramped room, resolve hung heavier than the weather outside. Plans were drawn, entry points marked. By dawn, Morton Timber would be under siege. The snowstorm had eased to a steady fall by the time the convoy rolled out. Dawn had yet to break, and the mountains crouched in darkness, pine silhouettes stark against the faint glow on the horizon. The police vehicles moved without sirens, only the crunch of tires on frozen ground, and the crackle of radios breaking the silence. Ethan sat in the lead SUV beside a young officer, barely out of academy. The kid's jaw was tight at his breath fogging the glass. Ethan said nothing, only adjusted the strap of his coat eyes locked ahead. When the Morton timber warehouse loomed into view, it was a hulking shadow of gray concrete and corrugated steel. Sodium lamps cast jaundiced light across the lot, where two guards in heavy coats stamped their feet against the cold. Smoke curled from a vent on the roof, the only sign of life in the industrial yard. Claire's voice crackled over the radio positions. On my mark. The convoy split like water around a stone. Units peeled off to flank the building, moving in silence across the snow. Ethan dismounted with the main team, the young officer close at his heels. The cold bit hard the silence, heavier than any battlefield Ethan had known. Claire's hand cut the air. A battering ram swung. The front doors buckled, then burst inward with a metallic scream. Police hands, where we can see them, the shout reverberated through the cavernous interior. Ethan swept inside with the team. The smell hit him first resin, and machine oil sharp and choking. Towering stacks of timber rose like walls tarps draped across pallets, forklifts frozen mid-shift. Shadows moved, workers startled, some fleeing, others throwing their hands up. Shouts overlapped, boots pounded. Floodlights flared on, banishing the gloom and illuminating the scale of Morton's empire. The search was swift, methodical. Claire moved with a clipboard in hand, barking orders, her team sweeping every office and aisle. Up a narrow metal staircase, Ethan followed her into a glass-fronted office overlooking the floor. Filing cabinets lined the walls, drawers stuffed with ledgers. Claire yanked one open, eyes narrowing. 2 sets of books. She flipped through pages, the neat handwriting splitting reality in 2 columns, one version polished for auditors, the other a record of illicit shipments, payoffs, and timber volumes stripped illegally from the preserve. This is it, she breathed, holding the ledger open for Ethan. This is the spine of his empire. And it's broken. Ethan scanned the names, numbers, signatures every page, a nail in Morton's coffin. On the warehouse floor, the officers uncovered crates stamped with foreign shipping labels. Inside were lengths of rare hardwood, and their grain too fine, too old to be anything but protected growth. Sophia stepped forward, running her hand along one log, her face pale with anger. These trees were centuries old. He butchered them for cash. Other crates revealed equipment, illegal chainsaws, forged permits, sealed envelopes stuffed with bribe money. Photographers moved through, capturing every angle, evidence tags, multiplying like snowflakes. The truth had been buried in steel and concrete. Now it lay naked, undeniable. The storm of discovery had barely calmed when Morton himself appeared. He stepped through the open bay doors in a tailored wool coat, flanked by 2 lawyers in dark suits. His silver hair was slicked back, his expression carved into polite disdain. "Deputy Whitman," he said smoothly, as though greeting a guest to his home. "What exactly is the meaning of this?" Claire straightened. "You're under arrest, Mr. Morton." She held up the warrant, her voice cutting through the warehouse din. Morton's smile didn't waver. "This is a misunderstanding. Accounting discrepancies at worst. I'll have my attorneys clear it up before lunch." Behind him, the cameras flashed. The Gazette had been tipped off, reporters bundled in coats, their lenses capturing every second. The flash painted Morton's face in bursts of white, his calm cracking at the edges. "You can't do this," he barked as officers moved in. "I've fed this town, kept the school open, the church lit. I've given more than anyone. His voice echoed through the rafters, desperation bleeding through the practiced calm. Claire didn't flinch. The cuffs clicked shut around his wrists, the metallic bite louder than his protests. For the first time, Cedar Hollow's saint looked small. By noon, the news had reached every corner of town. Morton Timber had fallen. Its owner, the benefactor of church bazaars and school fundraisers, had been marched out in handcuffs under flashing cameras. The shock rippled fast like fire across dry grass. At the grocery store, mouths hung open over shopping carts. At the church, parishioners whispered in disbelief. In Edna's diner, the usual clatter of dishes was drowned by gasps and low voices. "He bought us with our own forest," one man muttered, staring at the newspaper. "All those donations," a woman whispered, "paid with stolen trees and blood." The town was stunned, betrayed its foundation, shaken. But beneath the disbelief was something else, a shifting of eyes. People glanced toward the ranger with bandages still fresh toward the scarred Marine who had refused to look away. Where once there had been suspicion, there was now something heavier. Respect. Not everyone escaped the fallout. Sheriff Hank McAllister had spent weeks deflecting, dismissing, warning Ethan off the truth. Now, with Morton in custody and evidence piled high, he had no words left. Reporters cornered him on the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward. "Sheriff, when did you first hear about the allegations? Why didn't you act sooner? Were you protecting Morton?" Hank's face was drawn eyes, ringed with sleeplessness. His answer was curt, his voice stripped bare. "The investigation is ongoing. No denial, no defense. Only silence, heavy enough to crush." In the eyes of Cedar Hollow, that silence was an admission. He had turned away when truth needed a voice. He had stood still while others risked everything. His badge no longer gleamed with authority, but with tarnish. When the day ended, Ethan stood outside the clinic where Sophia had returned for a checkup. Shadow's reins looped loosely in his hand. Snow drifted down in lazy flakes, soft against the raw edge of the day. He thought of Morton's face as the cuffs closed, the rage masked as righteousness. He thought of the forest scarred, but waiting for spring. And he thought of the town broken, but waking at last. Sophia stepped outside, her coat buttoned high, her breath fogging the air. She met his gaze, her expression a mix of exhaustion and triumph. "It's not over," she said quietly, "but it's a start." Ethan nodded, rubbing Shadow's neck. "Sometimes that's all you need." The stallion snorted, stamping once. The sound echoed into the hush of Cedar Hollow, a reminder that truth had teeth and that even giants could fall. The snow had not stopped, but Cedar Hollow felt different. On that late winter afternoon, the streets were still blanketed in white rooftops, sagging under weeks of accumulation. But the people carried themselves with a new kind of energy. Doors that had stayed shut against the cold now swung open. Families bundled in scarves and boots made their way toward the town square, on their breath clouding in the crisp air. A sense of anticipation pulsed in the community, something brighter than survival, something like pride. The community hall, a squat log building that had stood since the town's founding, glowed with warm lamplight. Inside, the walls had been strung with flags, yellow bulbs looped across beams, and rows of wooden chairs filled every inch of floor. The scent of pine boughs and coffee lingered, and the hum of voices rose steadily as neighbors crowded together. Lumberjacks in heavy flannels sat beside truckers, still smelling faintly of diesel. Mrs. Edna Parker, notorious for her sharp tongue, was perched near the front, arms crossed but eyes alert. Children fidgeted in their parents' laps, whispering excitedly about the horse they had heard so much about. At the center of it all sat Ethan Cole. For once he wasn't in a weather-beaten coat or faded fatigues. He wore a clean shirt and a sturdy jacket, his hair trimmed, his beard neat. He looked uncomfortable in the polish, but it mattered. Beside him, Sofia Alvarez leaned carefully in her chair, still bandaged, but her eyes alive with light. The fatigue of survival had not dimmed her conviction. And outside the hall, waiting with the patience of a sentinel, stood Shadow. His massive frame had been brushed until his coat gleamed like midnight silk. A simple wool blanket lay across his back, not decorative, only practical, but spotless, warm, and dignified. From the window, his silhouette loomed like a guardian carved against the falling snow. The hall filled until not a single seat remained. The murmurs quieted when Sheriff Mallory Hart stepped onto the stage. Sheriff Hart was not a woman who wasted words. In her pressed uniform, silver hair tied back, she looked like a force of nature in her own right. She waited until the hush was complete, then spoke, her voice clear, resonant, carrying to every corner of the hall. Cedar Hollow has endured a trial this winter, she began. Not just of snow and storm, but of trust. A man many called a benefactor was unmasked as a thief, a liar, and a predator. And the truth was not uncovered by chance. It was carried here by courage. Her gaze swept the crowd, pausing on Sofia, then on Ethan before lingering on the dark shape of Shadow through the frosted window. Tonight, she continued, we honor that courage. Not just in uniforms, not just in oaths, but in the hearts of those who refuse to look away. The hall erupted in applause, a thunderous swell that echoed off timber walls. Hart raised a hand for quiet, then turned first to Sofia. Ranger Sofia Alvarez, you stood against corruption, even when it tried to silence you. You refused to bow, refused to die for their lies. Cedar Hollow owes you its forest and its conscience. Sofia rose unsteady, but proud. The applause grew louder, children clapping with abandon. She bowed her head slightly, her lips pressed together in thanks. Next, Hart looked to Ethan. Ethan Cole, a Marine who bore scars from foreign deserts, and yet, when danger came home, you did not turn away. You saved a life, you carried truth into the open, and you reminded us that courage does not end with war. Ethan shifted in his seat, the weight of the words heavier than any metal. He rose slowly. The crowd's applause struck him like a wave. Faces that once eyed him with suspicion now shone with respect. He gave a small nod, nothing more, but in his chest, something long dormant stirred. Finally, Sheriff Hart's eyes softened. And then, there is Shadow. The room buzzed instantly, a ripple of excitement among children and adults alike. Hart smiled faintly, the severity easing from her face. A creature of the wild, fierce, untamed, scarred by men's cruelty. Yet when the hour came, he stood beside those who sought truth. He may not wear a badge. She paused, letting the silence settle. But tonight, he's earned one. The hall erupted. Cheers, whistles, laughter, hands pounding together until the beams shook. Through the window, Shadow lifted his head and snorted, the sound rolling like thunder. The crowd roared louder still. When the noise ebbed, Sofia stood. In her hands, she carried something small, wrapped in brown paper. She stepped down from the stage, moving slowly, determination lending her strength. The hall hushed again as she crossed to the doorway. The cold air rushed in when she pushed the door open, revealing Shadow in the swirling snow. Sofia unwrapped the package, revealing a scarf of green wool stitches, neat but handmade. She had woven it herself in the weeks of recovery, each loop of yarn a prayer, a promise. She approached Shadow, who lowered his massive head. Snowflakes clung to his dark mane. Sofia stroked his scarred shoulder, then draped the scarf gently around his thick neck. "For the guardian of Cedar Hollow," she whispered. Shadow stood still, the scarf bright against his black coat, the green of forests yet to come. His breath rose in plumes, and for one long heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then the hall erupted again, louder than before, voices raised in a chorus of gratitude. Children pressed against the doorframe to see. Grown men wiped at their eyes. Even Edna Parker let out a sigh that sounded suspiciously like approval. Back inside, Ethan sat quietly watching it all unfold. For years, he had walked Cedar Hollow like a ghost, nodding at neighbors who never looked twice, carrying scars no one asked about. He had been the veteran on the fringe, the man with a horse too wild to belong. But now he looked around and saw different eyes. Eyes full of respect, of thanks, of recognition. He met the gaze of Edna Parker herself as she marched over, her lips pursed tight. She thrust out her hand. "Guess I was wrong about you, son," she said gruffly. Ethan clasped her hand, his throat thick. "Happens to the best of us." Her laugh was short, but real. As she moved away, Ethan sat back, letting the applause and laughter wash over him. He felt the sting in his eyes, the weight in his chest, but it was not the weight of loneliness anymore. It was belonging. Across the hall, Sophia caught his gaze. She smiled, small, warm, certain. It wasn't just camaraderie. It was acknowledgement, the bond of two who had stood together in fire and walked out alive. Shadow, visible through the window, lifted his head, his ears twitching as though he understood. When the ceremony ended, the crowd spilled into the square, voices echoing under the falling snow. Families lingered, talking in clusters, faces glowing in the lamplight. For the first time in months, laughter outweighed whispers. Ethan stepped out into the night with Sophia at his side, Shadow following close. The snowflakes fell soft now, drifting rather than cutting the storm at last, giving way to gentleness. He listened to the chatter of his neighbors, the squeals of children, the bark of a dog somewhere down the street. The sound no longer pressed against him like judgment. It welcomed him. He breathed deeply, the cold sharp in his lungs, and thought of everything they had endured, the crash, the sabotage, the cabin siege, the lies, and the truths. Justice had not come from courts or guns, but from persistence, from a ranger who refused to die a soldier, who refused to turn away, and a horse who refused to abandon them. He looked at Shadow, the scarf bright against the black of his coat. The stallion's breath steamed into the air, his eyes glinting with a light that was both wild and steady. The horse threw back his head and let out a ringing whinny. The sound carried across the square, up into the mountains, echoing through the snow-bound valley. Conversations paused. Faces turned skyward. For a moment, all of Cedar Hollow stood in silence, listening. Ethan felt something shift inside him, something that had been locked away since the desert. Belonging. Home. He glanced at Sophia. She smiled faintly, her breath clouding in the cold. "He knows," she said softly. Ethan nodded, eyes on the dark horizon. "So do I." The snow continued to fall, gentle as ash, covering the town in a new beginning. Cedar Hollow had changed, and so had they.
Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. We'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know your favorite part. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories like this one. And don't miss out. Hit the notification bell so you're always updated on our latest content. Your support truly means the world to us.